Hey, welcome to Storytime with the Historists with your hosts, Matt Breen and Jen Dumas.
All right, guys, we're just going to hop right in today into our topic that we've been hitting up in class. That is, of course, the Mongols. And we're going to really zoom in on this idea of destructive creativity as it applies to the Mongols. Before we can get anywhere, let's acknowledge some of our source work for that term, destructive creativity. We're getting that from Dan Carlin's Hardcore History and his epic series, Wrath of the Khans. Right? Now, the traditional view of the Mongols is really well earned. This is a brutal people coming off the steppe, destroying everything in their way, and taking whatever they can. And the proof for that, the evidence that we need, is right there in the dead. 50 million dead people, right? So we're going to talk about this Central Asian cataclysm and how the Mongols' destruction didn't benefit anybody, it hurt everybody, right? And the best way that we can exemplify this is looking at what happened at the siege of the city of Xiongnu in northern China, right? Now, this story comes down to us from a series of reports that were made by these spies that were sent into China. And the thinking here from the Sultan was China might be ripe for the attack. And we know that it was because the Mongols attacked. These spies make their way up to the city. They see this large pile, a mountain that they think is a snow-covered hill or something to that effect. You know, the source word is not totally clear. The point here, though, is as they get closer, they realize that these are sun-bleached bones. These are dead people, and the ground underfoot is soggy. It's rendered fat. It's the dead bodies of the Chinese people who lived in the city of Xiongnu, right? And we have to ask ourselves, well, how does this happen? Because Xiongnu is a huge metropolitan center. It's a 100 million plus citizen city. It's walled off. It's well protected. It's well garrisoned with a series of underground battlements and troops. And this city of people living peacefully in the Chinese Empire is totally slaughtered, right? And what's the reason for that? It's Genghis Khan's drive for more land. You can think about a Hitler in this regard, somebody whose drive for more land for his people allowed him, enabled him to commit these audacious acts, right? And here's a little warning for you guys because we're about to get into some heavy subject matter, right? But the city being sacked and destroyed, that was bad enough, but it's what happened to some of those people inside of the city or what they chose to do that really lets us know how brutal the Mongols were. Right? The secret history of the Mongols lays down to us that potentially 60,000 women threw themselves from the walls of the city of Xiongnu and rather die than become part of the harem, if you will, the women controlled by the Mongols, right? And that gives us a really good idea of how awful these people were. And then we ask ourselves what sort of destruction or creativity.
So, Matt, I totally get where you're coming from, but especially the idea that he like launches this fire, this destructive fire across Afro-Eurasia. But what we've also got to acknowledge is the fact that from this ashes or from these ashes, we get two things that we haven't seen in a very long time. One of which is religious freedom, especially in East Asia. And the second thing, which is as important or even more important, is the reinvigoration of the Silk Road.
So you're making this analogy that just like a forest fire is going to cleanse the forest of all that dense undergrowth, that Genghis Khan cleared the way for something new and better. But this better be a really good new and better because the Central Asian cataclysm brought by Genghis Khan is one of history's greatest travesties.
Okay, well, before we start calling it a travesty, and I'm not denying that the Mongols and Genghis Khan created this like tremendous amount of violence, but I think we also need to look at it from a little bit of a perspective, right? We talked about from the ashes comes the reinvigoration of the Silk Road and religious freedom, but what really Genghis Khan did is he took all the old stuff that we've seen in Central Asia for a very, very long time, and he kind of threw it in a pit, lit a match, and then let the flames fly. I really want to talk about this Silk Road issue because that's really one of the most important long-term legacies that we see with Genghis Khan. Now we know that the Song dynasty lost control of the northern part of the Silk Road around 1127 CE to the northern nomads who have constantly been a thorn in China's side. So we get that, but it left the Silk Road in complete disarray. I mean, we had destruction of infrastructure, people weren't trading, we didn't see an increase of ideas or luxury goods traveling from west to east or east to west. And when the Mongols do make their conquests, starting around 1200, they end up conquering all the territory that the Song dynasty lost. And once they conquered that territory and were able to get rid of the thieves and bandits and other nomadic tribes who were threatening the safety of the Silk Road, then all of a sudden people want to trade again, right? And then once that trade increases, or at least the idea of trade increases, or the desire for trade increases, the Mongols are only going to further that. And we know from our study with the Mongols that trade was always really important. They were these nomadic pastoralists. They didn't or weren't able to produce everything they needed within the society, no matter how resilient they were. And so they've understood the importance of trade for a very long time. And so when they gain control of the territories in which the Silk Road goes through, I mean, it's a no-brainer that they're going to reopen it, which they did. The first way they did that, like we just said, was through increasing safety. But the second way they were able to do that was by rebuilding and improving infrastructure. When the Song dynasty had lost the Silk Road, at least control of the Silk Road, we know that the roads were in disarray, bridges had been destroyed, all the caravanserai that had been on the Silk Road for a very long time, they were left basically in dilapidated conditions. And so when the Mongols came in, they rebuilt these roads, they added bridges, they improved the roads that were already there, and then added more canvasseri, but then more importantly, they took their YAM system. And if you guys remember, or if you don't remember, the YAM system was a postal system created by the Mongols designed to transfer information, communication from one end of the empire to the next. Well, what they ended up doing is taking this YAM system and basically transforming the postal stations into relay systems. And at each of these points along the Silk Road, at each of these yams along the Silk Road, that these travelers, these merchants, had access to food, to shelter, to animals like yaks and camels and horses, which made travel even easier along the Silk Road, which again is going to stimulate commerce. But they did more than even just that, right? Besides safety, besides infrastructure, they made the idea of trade more lucrative. Number one, they increased the social status of merchants. And we know in East Asia, merchants were super low on that social hierarchy because of Confucian values. But now Genghis Khan and the Mongols are like, no, dude, you're a merchant. You're like a superstar, right? And so more people wanted to be merchants. And then throw that in with little tax breaks for merchants. That's going to encourage more people to go out and trade along the Silk Road. And then as you're trading, if you know that your paper money that you have is going to be 100% fully guaranteed in precious metals and guaranteed by the Mongols, then the risk for trade decreases, which means if there's less risk, even more people are going to take to the Silk Road. And then finally, in one of the less talked about areas in which the Mongols really increased trade along the Silk Road was this idea of shared knowledge, right? The Mongols would take from the different regions they conquered, especially scholars and silk weavers and architects and engineers. They would basically, it's not really outsourcing, they would take these skilled people and they would move them to different areas of the empire so that these people could share their knowledge. And so we get, Persian rug makers who are Central Asia and live in Central Asia and teach other people in Central Asia how to make the rugs. Or we get Chinese silk makers who were sent to Samarkand, and so we could train more people in the silk trade. And all this does is increase the amount of goods that are produced within the Mongolian Empire. And if you increase the amount of goods, you're going to increase the amount of trade, which is once again going to be that reinvigoration of the Silk Road that we're talking about.
So I totally have to grant you that the Silk Road being reinvigorated was a big deal. That's totally true. But let's look at the people who were destroyed, right? Those people who were destroyed, you said that took over northern parts of China, the Jurchen, the Jin, those are the people at Xiongnu who are being killed. So it's their blood that lays the foundation in many ways for the Silk Road, right? And the other thing that we should keep in mind is while all those points are valid and true, what really occurs here is the Yuan dynasty, the sinification of the Mongols that really starts to reinvigorate the Silk Road, that leads to the Yuan system, that leads to all the positive benefits that you just laid out. So who's to say that this wouldn't have happened anyway?
Well, I mean, I totally get what you're saying, that it is true that these smaller Central Asian kingdoms or little empires were impacted by the Mongols, but to say that they would have traded anyway, we would have had that increase in trade even without the Mongols. Yeah, I don't really believe that. And here is why, right? It's true like the Jerkins and everyone else could control their small area of trade, right? Their little, circle of trade. But what happens when you go 100 or 200 miles outside of the region and they don't have the ability to protect? And so when people are traveling along those roads, the possibility of thievery and banditry is right there. And so for trade to really be reinvigorated, you have to control the entire route, and that only happened because of the Mongols.
That's true. I mean, that's very, very true. So you're thinking about that whole old saying that in the Mongol Empire, a man could have walked the entire distance to the Silk Road with a gold plate on his head, right? That's the point that you want to make here?
Exactly.
All right, but here's the thing, the Central Asian cataclysm that we've talked about isn't just battlefield dead. It isn't just sacked cities and kingdoms and destroyed people in Central Asia. It's also the spread of epidemic disease. Because once you open up those pathways, once you create mobility, people aren't just carrying gold plates or silk or anything else. They're also carrying with them disease. The bubonic plague makes its way out of Central Asia, out of its isolation inside of China, and this thing is going to burn down Europe. It's going to burn down the world of Islam. It's going to burn down China. We're talking about destruction that not even Genghis Khan could create overall, right? And so, yes, trade good, but when we talk about this Central Asian cataclysm and we talk about destructive creativity, we're not just talking about battlefield dead. We also have to think about the spread of epidemic diseases.
We can talk for hours about this, Matt. I mean, I can go on, time and time again, focusing on the rebirth that we got after the destructive fires you're talking about with Mongol rule in Afro Eurasia.
Yeah, and I could hit, every single atrocity from cannibalism to, the number of dead here in Russia, the number of the dead there in, Turkey and all that sort of stuff. You're right. We could do this all day long.
Can we at least agree, though, that regardless of the death, regardless of the destruction, that the Mongols do usher in an age of modernity that most likely would not have happened without their rule?
Yeah, I know where you're going with this. So if you guys want to know more about the Mongol rule, you got to tune in for episode number 2, Pax Mongolica.
So thanks for staying with us with Storytime with the Historist today. I'm Jen Dumas,
Mr. Boreen, Matt Boreen.
and we'll see you next time.
All right.